Tax settings and government policies are at the centre of the emerging build-to-rent sector's adoption here in Australia. To help us understand how this rather complex and technical environment impacts the industry's appetite for build-to-rent is Sydney Managing Partner at MinterEllison, Nathan Deveson. Thanks for joining us on The Urban Developer.
Thanks very much, Adam. Good to be here.
Now, Nathan, let's just start with the big picture. What's been your involvement in the build-to-rent sector in Australia as it's emerged?
So I'm largely a tax partner, but also very much involved in structuring property transactions over many years. And a bit over 4 years ago, I was one of the original member of the Property Council of Australia's Build to Rent Roundtable group. So I've been on that group since its inception, and it's been a great way to be part of the industry in forming and developing this asset class right from the start, as we've developed all of the policies that we need to deal with governments, and also been out doing some advocacy work, but seeing the industry work out what build to rent means in Australia and start to see some developments happening. It's been quite a fun thing to be part of the journey.
Yeah, I can imagine it's really ramped up over a 4-year period. Now, I just want to talk through some of the key items, the key issues that we really frequently hear from the industry. Start with the managed investment trust schemes and the settings considered one of the key hindrances to global capital entering this sector. Can you just explain what that actually is and why it's important?
Sure. So everyone wants foreign capital, and the build to rent industry is absolutely part of the broader property classes that are chasing foreign capital. The managed investment trust regime is about setting up certainty around withholding tax rates for foreign investors and providing concessionary withholding tax rates so that foreign capital effectively can be cheaper to get in Australia. So for most assets in real estate that are held by a MIT, they'll be taxed at the 15% withholding tax rate. It can drop to 10% for green buildings, but 15% is the standard working rate. After some lobbying, we were able to get build to rent into the MIT regime. Initially it wasn't, but it's in at the 30% tax rate. So really there is no tax advantage that comes from the MIT regime from a withholding tax perspective for build to rent. And it also means that build to rent is disadvantaged compared to just about any other asset class in real estate. So the withholding tax you're paying on build to rent for foreign capital will be twice what you'd be paying on an industrial or an office portfolio.
And so how likely is this to change over the coming years? You've obviously done some lobbying work. Is there a likelihood that lobbying work will continue and bring it back down to, say, the 15% range?
From what I understand, under the Morrison government, the rules are pretty much set. That's their policy position, and they're not open to discussing that further at the moment. But discussions with the opposition have been, I understand, more fruitful, and the opposition may well be willing to come to the party. But at the moment, I think we are where we are.
Now let's talk GST then. The treatment of GST is another factor that is considered a bit of an impediment to the development of build to rent in Australia. Can you explain how GST works in relation to build to rent and its impact on the feasibility models?
Sure. So build to rent is treated like any other form of old residential property under the GST rules, which means you don't pay any GST when you buy or sell the property. You don't pay any GST on the rent, but you can't get input tax credits on the costs that go into a build. So that means if you're going to start with a build to rent development, the land you'll buy, you won't get a credit for any GST that's payable on that land. On your construction costs, you'll have to absorb the extra 10% GST cost as well, but you don't have to pay any GST on the rent. So that drives up the input cost of the product. And given that a lot of the margins are pretty slim in terms of the feesos on build to rent, that extra 10% input cost on the build can really squeeze your margins even further. It's interesting though, because other types of commercial residential property can have a lower rate of GST on the rent. So they actually charge GST on commercial residential premises at the 5% rate, and then can get the input tax credits on the build. So there's a bit of a mix between commercial residential premises, which build to rent is not. And so build to rent is at a disadvantage to some other sort of commercially driven residential projects.
Yeah, it's interesting when you stack it up against traditional build to sell. The cost of construction in really simple terms is 10%, roughly 10% more as well. So is there any likelihood that that's going to change in the future?
Not anytime soon.
So let's talk.
It's almost impossible to get the GST law changed, and I don't see it happening around this anytime soon.
Okay, we'll put an O against that one. Let's talk about state-based land taxes then, because this is a really complicated item in relation to feasibility projects and, again, how they stack up in different jurisdictions. How do the policies of the different states stack up effectively?
So there's 3 states that have announced land tax concessions, and that's New South Wales, which is fully legislated, all of its guidelines are out. Victoria, which has announced it, but its guidelines and detail aren't out yet, and South Australia, which has announced it as well. So these land tax concessions have an origin in understanding that when you've got a build to rent product, you're probably really competing against a mum and dad residential investor and their apartment. So the tenants are weighing your build to rent apartment up against their normal residential. And most mum and dad investors don't pay any land tax in relation to their investment apartment. Whereas you put a block together of build to rent and there's land tax payable on the entire development effectively. And so that puts you at a cost disadvantage to a mum and dad investor. So if we're trying to create a level playing field, there was a need for some land tax concessions to come in to reduce, again, the input costs that go into build to rent. It's also a bit of a concession by government who are trying to launch this new asset class. So the proposals, again, primarily in New South Wales, provide for a 50% reduction in the land tax if you comply with the guidelines. And the guidelines set out criteria around the size of the development, generally more than 50 apartments. And they've got certain other criteria around the use of apprentices and how and local labour to build the product, but also some guidelines around affordable and social. And that's something that we can talk about as well. But the government still doesn't fully understand that build to rent is a commercial product at generally above market rent. Governments do want to try to squeeze in affordable and social into build to rent to make it part of the broader development. And they're only giving their concessions when you're giving them some of that social and affordable.
Like many things in this country at the moment, the states are running at different speeds, unfortunately. So it is a very important one to take note when you're modelling up your FESOs. Now, let's just talk about then some of the pilot programs and policies that have been introduced by the different states to support build to rent. You touched on it there, particularly with respect to the supply of affordable and social housing. What have been these programs across the different states?
Yes, I've been really lucky over the last 4 years to advise both private developers as well as government on the development of this sector. And I have given some advice to government in relation to their pilot programs. What they are trying to do is achieve a level of social and affordable housing, social or affordable housing, depending on who it is, into these builds. But they're only achieving that by way of providing some sort of subsidy. So the initial project in New South Wales that was proposed effectively supplied the land on which developers would then build, and in return New South Wales government would get a share of social housing. And that project hasn't progressed as quickly as many would like, but it's still there. In Queensland, on the other hand, the subsidy that was provided for the affordable housing was effectively an underwrite of rent, and so a guaranteed return on particular parts of that rent. And they're two very different ways of trying to achieve that subsidy so that the project can stack up financially and they can still get the affordable or social housing that they want. So I think there's a bit of room to go on that as the industry works out which of those two models is going to be best, and then really what the policy settings are for governments as they do come into these build to rent pilots.
Are there any views in-house within your firm as to which one's more effective in a particular way?
Look, no, I don't really have a view. Industry, I'm sure, is forming its view, and it's probably leaning more towards the cash subsidy. But I think it just depends on how the financials work out on the particular project.
Which is the Queensland model.
That's right.
Now, just washing that all together and bringing it all together, it seems that sort of regardless of some of these policy settings that, one could argue are slowing things down, both global and local capital seems to be piling into the sector in spite of it. What's been your experience over the last year, 12 months? And what's the future pipeline look like from your point of view, and the appetite and the willingness just to get in there and get it done regardless of these settings?
Yeah, the growth's been quite amazing in the number of announced apartments and developments going ahead. So 18 months ago, I probably could have listed on a page all of the actual build-to-rent projects or proper build-to-rent projects that have been announced. And now there's so many, and there's thousands of apartments announced. So I think it's fantastic that the industry is actually happening and the capital seems to be flowing. Whilst there's been a lot of announcements, the number of shovels that have gone into ground yet is still not quite as we would hope. And part of that is, again, some of the slower policy responses by government. For example, Victoria hasn't released its land tax concession details, which may be putting a pause on some projects because no one wants to start before the details get announced and maybe miss out on the concession because they developed too soon. The other thought is that the more capital that comes in, the less need for some of these concessions there may be, and the government might decide that concessions are no longer needed. I think that would be wrong. And I think that the industry is still very much in its infancy, and government should do whatever it can to encourage build to rent to really flourish, to provide all of those alternative housing sources and options.
Now, it would be a bit remiss of me not to ask this. You're in lockdown in Sydney at the moment. I mean, how are your clients holding up, and how's your business holding up as the prognosis looks to become more and more serious?
Well, it's almost like normal at the moment for all of us. So I think we all know after last year we learned how to do this. This year, I think we're just getting on with it. People see the other side. Many will have seen the modelling that shows the impact of vaccines coming through. So life will return to new normal, which will have us out. I think from my experience, my clients are getting on and doing their deals. The capital is flowing, and we'll see the light at the other side. And there are still build-to-rent projects being talked about that haven't been announced, and we look forward to seeing more and more of them.
Fantastic, Nathan. Thank you for so eloquently explaining a very complex and technical subject. We'll come back to you in the future, no doubt.
Thanks very much, Adam.
Thanks, mate.